So with that intro, let's get started with Module 1, what operators need to know on day one. We've just had a preview of the entire training program, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what rotomolding is. We'll also later talk about some manufacturing vocabulary. We'll look at a basic machine layout and kind of identify the anatomy of a mold. We're going to very briefly talk about materials and tools that you'll likely encounter as you get out on the shop floor. We'll provide a quick overview of the rotomolding process. And lastly, we'll talk about safety. When you go home on your first day, people are going to ask what you do. And when you say that you're in rotomolding, they'll likely ask what that is. And we want to provide you with a little bit of ammo so you can respond and people will know what you do. So rotomolding, or otherwise known as rotational molding sometimes, is a manufacturing process to make plastic parts. It sounds pretty simple, but rotomolding has some unique advantages. We can make parts in smaller production volumes. The parts are commonly larger. They're usually hollow, and they often are very complex shapes. Our process is very manual and not very quick, so we're typically making one or a few at a time, and it's considered a pretty slow process. And when you look at this list, you might wonder, so what's so great about rotomolding? And this list is what's so great about it. We can make large parts that are hollow, that are complex, in small volumes, and a lot of the other processes, the other manufacturing processes for making plastic parts can't do that. These limits aren't always the case. There are small parts, and there's solid parts, and there's simple shapes, and many are made at a time. But as a summary, that's kind of a really basic answer if somebody were to ask what rotomolding is. And one of the things that helps me often is to just reference things that people are already familiar with. When you try to explain what you're making, it can be confusing. And when you explain perhaps what people are already familiar with, like kayaks are rotomolded, or toys are rotomolded, large tanks are rotomolded, playground equipment is rotomolded, and the new super coolers are rotomolded. And when you reference these things, it sometimes helps people kind of relate to what we're doing at work every day. Let's talk just a little bit about some manufacturing vocabulary. Oftentimes when we hire new people, we'll put them through, and some of you are going through orientation for your company, and then you get out on the shop floor and sometimes feels like people are speaking a different language. So we're not going to spend too much time, but we want to introduce some manufacturing vocabulary for you today. As materials move through your shop, they change their name, and it's important for people to know what things are. When you buy materials and you bring them into your warehouse and your facility, all of those materials someday are going to become your products. But until then, they're typically referred to as raw materials. And in literature, you'll see that abbreviated to RM. So plastics and inserts and graphics, your cardboard and your pallets and all those things would be considered raw materials. And typically it's easy to tell what raw materials are because you can see them in the end product. But that's not always the case. There are raw materials that are called consumables that kind of get used up during the process. And so one example of that would be mold release. You spray mold release in your mold, but you actually can't see it on the final part. Drill bits, sandpaper, rags, sometimes those things would be considered consumables, but all of that's kind of in one big bucket called raw materials. When you take that raw material and you start using it and shaping it into products, those products will often be referred to as WIP, work in progress. And so perhaps a molded part that hasn't yet been finished sitting on a shelf as inventory would be considered WIP. So those are your raw materials that are starting to take shape and starting to look like a finished good, which which is the last category. So it starts as raw materials. You use it in your factory and turn it into a product that's called WIP,